Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you again to our Monday strategic update with LaRouche PAC. And I'm joined by Michael Steger. We have an exciting discussion for you this afternoon, or this evening, rather, losing time here. And I want to just give you a sense. As the title of our discussion tonight is going to be "The Future Belongs to the Patriots, Global Feudalists Panic as Nation Builders Advance." And this is exactly what we're experiencing right now in terms of our campaign to put an end to the speculation, Wall Street gambling, the Federal Reserve's looting, and endless money printing. And that's being done by our commitment to a solution. And the solution is we have to build the productive capabilities of our nation through a credit system, national bank policy. And that solution has been initiated and is being laid out very thoroughly through a class series that we also have in progress now, which I would first of all encourage everyone on this call to join us on this Saturday for the second installment of our class series, which is going to start with Brian Lance. And I want to highlight this very importantly because of when we think about the campaign that LaRouche PAC has initiated to abolish the Federal Reserve. We're not just talking about ending the money printing, but we're talking about, and the speculation, the continued inflation that is dominating our economy right now, and the fact that there's no solution coming from the avatar in the White House that just recently met with the chair of the Federal Reserve and laid out his so-called plan for dealing with inflation, which is not a plan at all. What he discussed from the standpoint that we're not going to touch or meddle with the affairs of the Federal Reserve, that's not a plan at all. That's what Biden said in talking with the members of the Federal Reserve, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and also Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary. Now, what has been a result, this has been a result of the failure of this banking system and globalist agenda that has been ongoing, that Lyndon LaRouche, as the leading economist and statesman, laid out the policy and platform for many years in terms of how do you build back the productive economy, get out of the system of collapse and continued system of bailing out Wall Street, and put an end to that system and bring in the producers again. That's why our campaign, LaRouchePAC.com, has been initiated through this idea of building, how would you actually build a manufacturing superpower? Build the United States, as President Trump called for in his campaign and throughout his presidency, to retool, reshore, and rebuild our productive capabilities. And obviously that was something that the globalists saw as a threat, the same way they saw it as a threat coming from Lyndon LaRouche. And now what we're seeing in our mobilization of candidates across the country, of Republican Party, of MAGA layers, is that people are absolutely ready for this solution to build back our nation and to put an end to the policies of the Biden collective's insanity of putting the green agenda as the top priority over economic progress and building the true American system of political economy. As a matter of fact, what I just noticed today, which is very interesting, is that there's a poll that came out, inflation, which it came out from a ABC News poll, LPSOS, and it says that inflation, economy, top of the minds of Americans heading into the midterms. And it says inflation is the single most important issue to voters. describing that 80% vote, 80% of the poll says that inflation is extremely important, addressing inflation is extremely important or very important. So I'm sure that all of you on this call can relate to that, as you know, we're seeing record prices in gas and food and everything else. And the other matter of this is that as Biden and his administration is trying to blame all this on Russia, on the Ukraine conflict, Russia, Ukraine, what has now been made it's been stated clearly and is known to the American people who are not buying these lies, is that this has nothing to do with Putin, Russia, or anyone else. It has to do with the policies that have been put forth in the United States that are destructive policies that are destroying our economy. So with that, one of the things we're going to talk about tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael in a second, is how we build out of this crisis. And one thing I want to give people a sense of is, for example, we have, in terms of our campaign, what we are doing is coming up next week. For example, we're leading the charge here in Texas. I, along with some of my colleagues here, are going to be taking this initiative as well as doing the same in other parts of the country, of adopting resolutions and getting resolutions adopted. We're calling on candidates, and we'll be having another web page put up of candidates supporting our initiative for the ending the Fed and creating a national credit system. Just to read you as an example, the legislation, or resolution that was adopted in one of the state party executive committees here in Texas, and that we're going to be continuing to fight for. And this gives you an example of resolution that you can get passed in your Republican executive committee or candidates can endorse. It says, be it resolved of the resolution says, quote, we support the abolition of the Federal Reserve and the creation of a constitutional third national bank of the United States based on a gold reserve foundation focused on investing in the industrial, agricultural, and infrastructural growth of our nation, end quote. Very direct piece, and we're going to be discussing how we build out all of those capabilities in terms of how a national bank and a credit program would be investing into those policies. So that's what we're calling on you to take action with us on, and we'll be discussing that and a bit more as we get more into the discussion after Michael's opening remarks here.
Thanks, Keisha. All right, so welcome everyone to this weekly discussion. Always appreciate people taking the time out. We've got longer daylight hours, so East Coast, West Coast, there's more time in the day. And yet you still get on and want to participate in this discussion. So look, I think we've got, as you probably know, and I don't think it's unique to say this at this point, this is the most severe economic crisis we've ever seen. We've only just begun to experience the kind of, the kind of consequences that occur from this kind of just extreme incompetence as well as malicious intent. Just the oil prices alone are a result of what looks like political incompetence, but remember, Biden was chosen. Now, there's massive demoralization in the White House, reportedly. There's talk about major change of staff even before the midterm, because it's going to be a massacre for the Democrats from all basic, indications. But as Biden himself said it, this program of incompetence is intended to create massive gas prices. We like this squeeze. We like to so-called push this into electric cars. It doesn't push things into electric cars. Elon Musk just said he's cutting 10% of the employment at Tesla. You're not driving anything towards anything except you're squeezing the population. But consider the fact that gas prices have nearly doubled in the last 4 or 5 months. Oil production globally has been the same. Now, it's probably about 4 million barrels per day short of the basic mark global demand it was at prior to COVID. And it was on a constant rate of increase prior to that point. But 4 million barrels short is not double price increase. So the price increase is coming from both the hyperinflationary panic that was already set afoot because of the COVID and general spending policies, and the increased factor of uncertainty because of a lack of commitment towards populations and institutions that are vital for populations. So investors, either rationally or irrationally, redirect and start to speculate on these kind of basic commodities. I mean, I don't think it's surprising to anyone that the dollar's basic backing has been the oil price since we took the dollar off gold in 1971. That was the petrodollar, the Nixon agreement with the Saudis. And it was a much more sordid story than just that. But the question you have to say is, it's not a question of collapse of production per se. It is an irrationalist system that's at play. And this is just a devastating breakdown. And it's a devastating political breakdown. And we've covered this kind of systemic nature of this characteristic, both in its immediate and then longer term perspectives. But one of the aspects of this call is what are these calls? And again, I would ask everyone who's attending to one, we want to increase our political activity. In most cases, we're getting to the point of post-primaries, where there are now official candidates running. In some cases, you're still in primaries. We're going to be looking at candidates on the ballot for November to get out and engage with candidates, to engage in discussions with them, state rep candidates, city council, county commission candidates, federal rep candidates. All of them are dealing with these national and global issues. Nobody is able to sit there and say, well, I'm going to fix the potholes in my county or city, without addressing the fact that most of their people are getting crushed by this hyperinflationary trend. So, this is meant to be somewhat an activist call, but it's also more than that, because there are a lot of activist groups. You don't get on here simply to discuss activism. We are going to be we hold regional activist calls. We're going to hold one on the West Coast this Thursday. So if you're on the West Coast, certainly get on that. That's a chance for people who are politically active to get on, share their thoughts. It's less of a directed discussion like these are, and more of a broad, just kind of open environment to kind of hash things out, see what's happening, and let people come in and give their side of things. But there's something more to these calls. And the question is, well, what is that? What are we actually participating in? Why is it so valuable that really relatively few of us are willing to get together every week and discuss something that is broader than just the immediate circumstances, which seems to have an intellectual or philosophical characteristic, as well as an immediate political or strategic one? Well, the reason for that, and the reason that unfortunately it's so rare, is because we represent a conspiracy that is directly opposed to this globalist faction. It's a conscious and intended conspiracy. It is not simply a political policy commitment or a party organization or grassroots efforts in that regard, but to set an intellectual or standard bearer around a different conception of what it means to be human, and how that then reflects from what the globalists intend, and how that reflects a completely different political, economic, and cultural worldview that we drive towards, that we see as the means and methods by which we kind of, I guess, bring to light our humanity, bring to light that which makes us so distinct and unique. You know, you see this in Elon Musk's policies towards space exploration. You see this in Donald Trump's policies towards rebuilding the United States, rebuilding its manufacturing. You know, there's a pejorative out there called nation building from our foreign policy escapades over the last many years. And it's because we've spent so much time in Afghanistan as one example, nation building. We were never nation building. That was never anybody's intent to build up Afghanistan to be a flourishing nation or people. It was pure corruption. It was pure political, imperial kind of control with a few puppet figures that were locally, you know, brought in from the population, Ghani or whoever. Nation building or city building, the questions of building civilization are something ancient in the course of human history. And this is something drastically different than what we've seen from the Davos, Wall Street, London globalist crowd, or from the Uniparty in Washington, and what have become to dominate most state capitals. Their view is that they're going to tax rent the population, whether it's feudalism, where you have, you know, lords, you know, landlords collecting money off of people directly as a broader economic system of serfdom, whether it's communism, whether it's corporatism and taxation. As a whole system, it's basically you're here to serve the interests of some higher power, the government, the state, landlords, the structure of society. In essence, the system. You're here to serve that, and the system will do what it can for you when it can, and when it can't, it's going to have to eliminate some of you. That's the intrinsic nature of that globalist perspective, and it's been true for thousands of years. And the tactics remain the same in every case. You know, it's not as if the counterculture of drugs, sex, degeneracy, loud music, incoherent, rabidly irrational outlooks, and the new cultural kind of cult formations around, you know, feminism, sexual identity, depopulation or human population questions. These are, and we've referenced it before, the very tactics and methods you'll find throughout human history to create the conditions where you can shut down this ancient city building or nation building tradition. And I'm going to touch a little bit on what that is in a second. But what we're participating is a revival of the intellectual side, the intellectual faction that is self-aware or self-conscious of this political and intellectual fight. And that it's not a question of separating economics or politics or culture, but it's a question that we are in a fight for which course of action and direction civilization itself takes. And that we recognize that that strategic outlook, that broader view, gives each of us an ability to act on the local stage, whatever level we've been able to accomplish, to make our voices heard regarding what this current movement today, what Trump has inspired, what the American people have within their bones, within the history of our country. I mean, the actual United States, as a hypothesis, is what? It is of this ancient faction of building a civilization, of not accepting the crushing forms of feudalism, of rent control, of taxation, and brutal imposition of wars and cults and irrationality, that we wanted to reject that. whether it was the Pilgrims, Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Quakers as they settled Pennsylvania, whatever process came over, they looked to participate in that kind of industrial growth, cultural sense of growth and mission that existed. And that we took that idea and we made it the very founding principle of our nation itself. That is what it means to make America great again, to revive that principle, not just in political practice, but in self-conscious intent. This is why we have this discussion. If people listen to Bob Ingram's class, this is why the questions of distinguishing John Locke and British liberalism as something totally contrary to the United States is so important, because it is these broader questions that allow us to understand and recruit hopefully increasingly the layers around Trump, these emerging political layers, what you see from people like Tucker Carlson or others who have a better sense of what direction we have to take to move in the right direction. You know, there are a lot of people, especially within like the libertarian crowd, who see the problems of the Federal Reserve. They see the collapse. You know, let me take one person as an example, because he just did a couple of interviews recently, Peter Schiff. People may know Peter Schiff's work, and he's been a stockbroker and a financial advisor for a long time. He's also been extremely against the Federal Reserve, against the housing bubble, against the blowouts, the bailouts, and he's very keen on the current crisis. And he can identify all the various elements of the current insanity fairly effectively. In some cases, he's one of many accurate critics of the current system. You know, the massive government debt, for what exactly? For government expenditures, monetized by the Fed for largely speculative purposes, the devaluation of the currency, it is bizarre that the Federal Reserve says now that its main goal is to create inflation. Even when I was a student, that wasn't something anybody was willing to say. You wanted to prevent inflation. You wanted things to go down in price, not up. Maybe a slow decline, but that's what you hope for. That would improve people's quality of life. So, but Schiff and others, especially within the libertarian networks and conservative layers generally, who are against the Federal Reserve, see these trends. But then if you ask someone like Peter Schiff, what should you do? He'll say, well, you should probably invest then in metals or in European companies in some form of production. It's like, wait a minute, this economic agenda, you know, that's just not a coherent answer. It's an answer as if I'm a financial advisor on your independent wealth. We're saying, look, we've got a rabidly psychotic faction in control of the direction of our economy. Where I invest is not really the existential question. The existential question is, how do we change this? And simply just stopping their insanity does not create a civilization. Because that's what economics ultimately is. It's the creation of a civilizational trend. Which trend? People may, and some of you may not be familiar, there's a popular concept called entropy. Now, if you haven't heard of it, you might want to become aware of it, because it is literally the concept of God governing most of your institutions, including every university today. It is the astronomical or cosmological constant from the standpoint of academic pseudoscience. It's what the closest they would come to admitting some characteristic of God. And what is it? It's that everything ultimately goes towards a kind of steady state of lowest energy, which economically would be, we all go back to kind of land peasants in a feudal state with a closed, fixed system of wealthy lords. More or less the Davos Great Reset. where you own nothing and are happy, so to speak. That characteristic is what economics is as a concept is meant to challenge. Real economics is a tool, is a science, as LaRouche conceived of it, and as this faction, this ancient tradition of city builders and nation builders, and I'll touch on some references to that, how they thought of countering this more bestial, irrational trend. And this is something that Schiff and other very accurate critics of the current financial system and of the Fed don't understand. And this is why when we talk about, say, national banking and a national bank replacing the Fed, it becomes so difficult to make a distinction, because this ancient tradition of building human civilization has been literally stripped out of cultural awareness. Much like we talked that the American system of economics was stripped out of any discussion by the 20th century, so was any tradition within science of a creative creator. I mean, Einstein lived in a universe with a creative creator, and he set forth the entire scientific paradigm we currently live in. But yet that creator, that conception of God, died within science, probably even before Einstein made his great discoveries, as an institutional cult of so-called entropy, or that kind of outlook. I mean, it very much is a death cult in its characteristics, and that pervades the highest levels of physics to a large extent. And then you wonder, how our universities, how our science with global warming has become so perverse. So the question is, how has this city building or nation building tendency, which is what a national bank is there to support, it's part of this outlook. It's part of this awareness that we uniquely, as human beings, are capable of building a civilization. It's not a question of comparing our traits to other animals. There is no other species that has shown this ability to so rapidly advance and develop. Now, one of the most kind of concrete examples, there are earlier ones, but they're less recorded. Certainly the Egyptians, going back really 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, were certainly advanced enough to be engaged in massive architectural and city and industrial development. This is where the pyramids come from. As we have records of transatlantic oceanic cultures from the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Celts, Iberian Celts from Spain and others in North Africa, who were participating in building some type of small colonies in the New World, whether it's along the eastern coast, up as far as Massachusetts, and even up the Mississippi River as far as Iowa. But those are less recorded, and they're, it's more of an archaeological factor. But you look at Alexander the Great. He initiated the construction of over 70 different cities. Cities are an industrial center. The ability to build cities, to build stone cities, cities largely out of stone, or at least some of their main structures, is an industrial undertaking. It requires transit capabilities. It requires skilled artisans. It requires infrastructure to be able to transport, to mine, and then people that are capable of building these structures. Roads, sewer systems, water systems, that kind of characteristic was something that not only did Alexander go out looking to or intending to destroy what's known by St. John as the Whore of Babylon. In that case, it was actually the Whore of Babylon as it existed in the East, not yet in Rome. But his conception was to build up a characteristic of civilization. You see this even in the Greeks prior to Alexander. Consider, and some of you may not know, but this will at least give you some sense, there were major campaigns within the Greek civil war, what we call the Peloponnesian War. One of them was this disastrous, and I would say Babylonian, Persian agenda run through people like Alcibiades. So it was basically Persian or Babylonian agents inside Athens who launched the most disastrous campaign into Syracuse, which is in Sicily. What was Syracuse? Syracuse was a major Greek city. It identified as Greek. The means by which it defeated the Athenians were the same approach, self-consciously, at least that's how it's reported, that the dialogue within Syracuse of how they would defeat the Athenian invasion was the same approach the Athenians took to defeating the Persian invasion. They were Greek in every way. They learned from the Athenians how to think of a self-government, a republic, a militia, and a military approach. And this wasn't just true in Sicily, this was true through much of southern Italy. If that Athenian approach, or this broader Greek, you might call it Ionian approach, of city building had continued, it would have continued up the peninsula of Italy. It would have continued throughout the coast of North Africa. Instead of having the Roman Empire, which was basically a brute force military operation, dominated by these sick and irrational cults, we would have had this civilization building. The same characteristic you see even in the Middle Ages with Charlemagne, with this quality. Now, I don't want to give more and more references. There's no reason to just give it. Hopefully those two specific references give some sense of a trend. If you look at what the Athenians and that period of Greek civilization was doing, it was building cities all over the place, up into the Black Sea, throughout the Mediterranean, moving westward, and ultimately with Alexander moving eastward. And then of course it was stopped. And there are specific details which could be referenced there in terms of how it was stopped and how Alexander was killed. But this is something our founding fathers studied. And they came out of that same tradition. It was this tradition that Donald Trump referenced when he went to Davos. And he said, you sick, he didn't say this, but he basically said, you sick, apocalyptic, irrational freaks with your cults of overpopulation or peak oil or all these other kind of concocted schemes to force people into doing something that's totally irrational, like with COVID. You guys are sitting here in the shadows of the greatest architecture and constructions of buildings perhaps mankind's ever done. And he referenced the Florentine Dome, which is perhaps one of the greatest architectural feats mankind has ever accomplished. And it's inspiring both in its beauty and its scientific and engineering tendency. So why do I reference this? Because if we're at a point in history today, and this is somewhat why Elon Musk is such an illuminating character. You know, he makes compromises on climate change, which he should basically just stop. But he has raised the question that the greatest crisis on the planet is the collapse in population. That is absolutely right. A friend of mine said in discussion with someone who knows the economy locally well, said in Detroit, the reason there's no investment is because there's no population sufficient, or there's not a sufficient population to support the infrastructure that has been so densely developed within Detroit. Well, that's what cities were. Cities are an efficient form of organizing incredibly high standards of living. That's what Alexander the Great was bringing. That's what this tradition has always recognized. That's what separated the Greeks from the barbarians. They recognize this is a higher form of organization which increases quality of life for the people involved. You put dense infrastructure, dense productive capabilities, and a well-trained, well-educated population, and you've got a thriving economic center. If you gut its industry and you basically lower the population because of it, the ability to support this advanced infrastructure is not there. nor is it going to be there in massive suburban sprawl. You can't just keep spreading housing developments further and further and further. Whether it's in China or the United States, it doesn't function as an approach. You have to build up economic centers of advanced industry and scientific and cultural advancement. You build up a civilization. You build up a capability of supporting the investments into a population and empowering them to be productive. This isn't government controlled. The government's there to make sure it functions and there's regulations and it's relatively safe, within bounds that are rational. It's there to help facilitate the deliberation. It's helped to make sure that our banking system fosters this direction. But you can't have a government functioning that way. No matter how great President Trump fought, how hard he fought, you can't have a government functioning at this level without a citizenry operating from this higher level of conspiracy. And this is what was unique to the United States. This is what Lyndon LaRouche reconceived. And when he reconceived it, he thought he was doing something relatively new. Now, he approached it in a more advanced scientific way. But what he came to realize is that what we were participating in our movement, in this discussion, this quality of deliberation, was something that had occurred over and over again. It just had been shut down as a cultural factor. That within the elites, there was a faction who ascribed to this sense that how you build a civilization, how you govern effectively, is to make sure you're advancing and building and developing. And that's really what Trump revived. He revived that spirit. You see other people responding. You see Elon Musk with the sense that we're going to build cities. He wants to build cities on Mars. He's also planning to do a $20 billion investment, basically down in Brownsville, Texas, at the very tip of Texas, and build up a city to support his Starbase and Starship production. That's a provocative idea. That's how you build cities. You build cities around that kind of productive characteristic, that kind of industrial capability. And this is what we're discussing when we discuss a kind of national banking, public credit, this kind of government. It requires a higher conception of culture. Now, the other aspect that Schiff and these critics get wrong or miss, and they may miss them maybe less now than they did before, but still nonetheless, is how severely we've injured our economic production. And that you can't simply restore it like you restored oil production since the lockdown of COVID. You can't just open up the pipelines and the oil starts flowing, you get the shipping going, and so on. You have to rebuild the culture and population's productive skills. You have to recreate these productive centers that did exist in the 40s and 50s, even into the 60s, before they were just shut down and moved first out into the suburbs, and then eventually taken from those, then taken from the small towns. And so part of the discussion this Saturday is going to be Brian Lance laying out the severity of the physical breakdown and then the kind of really intense steps that this outlook that builds civilization would adopt. At least it's an outlook or a characteristic policy program from that standpoint. This is what we're looking to revive. It's not just a positive policy program. We're asking you to participate in the most profound intellectual conspiracy. It was this that the Christian movement participated and shaped in the most profound way. And it's this that was revived in the Renaissance, even in the cathedral building of the 12th and 13th centuries, in the founding of our country. We are at a critical juncture in human history today. The kind of severe insanity that was started back even really with the death of Franklin Roosevelt. As soon as the post-war period starts, industrial centers like Oakland, California, or even New York City, there was immediately a program. San Francisco, Boston, MIT was situated as an advanced scientific research facility right next to industrial centers, light production, glass capabilities. So the scientific research was melded as an integral part of the productive and industrial side of society. As soon as the war is over, those aspects are gutted. And then science becomes a study of mathematical pursuits, digital programming, tech, rather than industrial production. And of course, our cities were gutted of that industry. And so the people that work there were now left with no longer work in those areas, high paying, high productive jobs. But this kind of insanity has never occurred at the point of such high levels of productive capacity, that by the 1940s and 50s, we'd reached a peak that no civilization had ever reached. The American experiment had truly proven more successful than even perhaps Alexander Hamilton might have imagined. Maybe not, but certainly a true success. And to rebuild that, to regain that, is going to require an increased devotion to this characteristic. The space program, fusion energy, and projects like the NWAPA program, the water development program in the West, are three areas. One of broad-scale infrastructure. That's what NWAPA represents. This is a collection of water in Alaska and Canada and a transfer down into the southwest of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico. It is the largest project ever designed in human history. It would have to be monitored as an integral whole by satellites in space. And it was designed in the 1960s independently on their own dime by an engineering firm in California. And to a large extent, it suffices. There are advancements that we can add to it, like nuclear power today, but it's a sufficient program. That's a broad scale development of civilization, because not only are you transferring water for farming and agriculture to what is known as the Sun Belt, but you're creating the conditions for new cities, industrial centers, transit capabilities, and really populating and developing the Western states. This would also, just as a side note, would also take Alberta, Saskatchewan, and that farm belt and oil belt of Canada, which pays all of Canada's taxes. It would actually provide water there because the drought has expanded. It's everything west of the Missouri River. The Dakotas are facing massive fire expansion. The Colorado River is now no longer providing the water based on contracted commitments. There is a severe drought. But even 60 years ago, Americans with foresight saw the way to deal with that. Fusion energy is a potential breakthrough that we could consolidate. There are already a dozen to 15 firms in the United States looking to advance this technology as a commercial program. That transforms the way we operate as a species. It's as if you could have all the electricity you want, any industrial enterprise, any consumer basis, as much as you want, practically for free. The cost of it would be so negligible if we can master that technology. The questions on that, because a lot of things are limited by how much energy they require, the cost goes up so much. When you open up the floodgates on energy supply to be practically unlimited, it's a fundamentally different characteristic of what you're now willing to figure out and solve with different techniques, because you're not limited by energy supply. And as Keisha knows well, and what something Elon Musk has participated in, Donald Trump's Operation Artemis, just begin to build cities, beginning with basically military science bases on the moon and then Mars, is really an extraordinary aspect of this characteristic of building civilization and reminding the future generations how unique mankind really is, to really banish the effect of these irrational cults. So that's I think, I wanted to put some meat, broad historical review, a sense of the kind of conspiracy we're participating in. But I wanted to at least give it a few very specific applications that may be worth discussing. So anyways, that's my sense of what we're participating in these calls. I hope that people have some things they're wanting to discuss, questions about the economy, questions of what we do. But to me, it's always so important to situate, where am I in history? What am I actually participating in? What is this process of civilization? Yes, there's an economic crisis. Yes, there's political incompetence. Yes, there's a cult of irrationality and violence all over our country and culture today. But how do we shift that? And how do we situate more Americans into this idea? Because I think that's the power of redemption. That's the real power of discovery, self-consciously participating in this dynamic. So hopefully that provides some context. I'd be interested to see what people have in terms of their own thoughts tonight, since it's such an intense and complicated period. And I guess, Keisha, we'll get at it.